It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, live from Beirut. Our top story. The enemy will face severe punishment. Hezbollah's leader accuses Israel of detonating thousands of electronic devices across Lebanon. The two sides exchange fire across the border. 2 Israeli soldiers are killed. Tonight, Britain calls for an immediate ceasefire as tensions escalate.
Also ahead on News at 10 tonight, the Prime Minister insists he's in control despite damaging headlines over his acceptance of gifts. As ministers admit some criminals released early weren't tagged, a serving prisoner governor tells us some of those let out will reoffend. And Post Office campaigner Sir Alan Bates blames government flim-flam artists for dragging out compensation payments to victims of the Horizon scandal. Plus, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through till midnight.
Good evening from Beirut. I'm Yalda Hakim. The head of the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah has threatened to retaliate against Israel for the deaths of at least 37 people in a series of explosions across this country. Hassan Nasrallah conceded that the detonation of thousands of Hezbollah communication devices over 2 days was an unprecedented blow. But he insisted that his group would emerge stronger and would continue to attack Israel. Well, Hezbollah targeted northern Israel during the day, firing anti-tank missiles and flying attack drones. The Israeli military says 2 of its soldiers were killed. Tonight, the Israeli Defense Forces said its air force has struck multiple Hezbollah infrastructure sites in southern Lebanon, including what they said was a weapons storage facility. Sky's data and forensics team have verified the location of a strike this morning to this location in the town of Khiam. During the Hezbollah leader's speech, the IDF announced it was striking further targets inside Lebanon, aimed at degrading Hezbollah's offensive capabilities. Our special correspondent Alex Crawford is in Beirut and has tonight's first report.
The cafes were crowded in South Beirut to gauge the mood of the Hezbollah leader, who was giving an unscheduled speech after 2 days of deadly explosions across Lebanon. The leader's speeches typically attract hundreds of supporters in public gatherings. Not this time, perhaps considered too much of a security risk now. He broadcasts remotely from a secret location for the same reason.
The enemy crossed in this operation all the rules, laws and red lines. They didn't care about anything at all, not morally, humanely or legally.
Mid-speech, Israeli jets flew over the capital, causing loud sonic booms. This happens often now, but few saw the timing as coincidental, and most Lebanese see this as a show of force during an especially anxious time. Soldiers are now positioned outside the main hospitals, which are still crowded with casualties and worried relatives and friends. And doctors are concerned about how they'll cope if there are more emergencies.
So how prepared are you right now?
We are actually very prepared in terms of, restocking our supplies, in terms of having our personnel all in alert and available to us. But, if a war starts, there is no enough preparedness that anybody can have. It's going to break the back of every single person and every single institution, and we're not different.
Surgeons have flown in from abroad to help, including 2 from Britain, one who spent months in Gaza treating the war wounded.
The idea of booby-trapping a pager. And yesterday we were taking out pieces of screws and springs from people's eyes, from their hands, from their faces. Is a kind of diabolical idea.
Some of the injured, including children, have been transferred to Iran, Hezbollah's strongest ally in the region. Pictures from the Iranian news agency showed the head of the Revolutionary Guards visiting them. He's promised a crushing response from the so-called Axis of Resistance against Israel. The explosion of so many pagers and handheld radios in public places has raised considerable alarm about a further dangerous escalation, with Britain's Foreign Secretary again warning British nationals to leave Lebanon whilst commercial options remain. The powerful fighting group designated a terror outfit by the UK and US is still burying its dead. Its fervent supporters view those killed as heroes, and they're laid to rest in a martyr's graveyard. The last few days have been the deadliest for Hezbollah since October the 7th, with dozens killed and hundreds of their fighters and supporters potentially maimed, as well as their communication network, all but seriously compromised. It's hard to see this as anything other than a complete disaster for the fighting group. It's almost inconceivable that they won't hit back. Hezbollah loyalists are convinced there'll be a strong response and refuse to contemplate failure. We're not worried, she told me, just sad our men weren't killed on the front lines, but killed instead in shops. She went on, whoever sees children losing their eyes is going to be sad, but soon you'll witness our revenge and victory. The cross-border attacks from Hezbollah and Israel have ratcheted up in the last few days, as Israeli officials announced a new phase of the war to return its residents to the north. In several visits to the border, we've seen communities on both sides emptied and destroyed. The Hezbollah leader has warned the Israelis they won't let them return. No killings, no assassinations, no all-out war can return residents to the border, Hezbollah has said. And that seems to signal there'll be no let-up in the deaths and devastation. Alex Crawford, Sky News, Beirut.
Well, there's growing international concern about the escalating situation. The UK has tonight called for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, but with strikes continuing this evening, could events here escalate into an all-out war? Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle has this analysis from Jerusalem.
Israel says it is entering a new phase in the war. Extra troops and equipment have been moved from Gaza towards the Lebanese border, and today the IDF Chief of Staff approved battle plans for the northern front. Israel has been striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon throughout the day, part of a daily tempo that has been going on for almost a year, but now with the dark clouds of war hanging over the region.
This is a new phase of the war. It bears opportunities, but also significant risks. Hezbollah feels it is being persecuted, and so the sequence of military action will continue. Our goal is to ensure the safe return of Israel's northern communities to their homes. As time goes by, Hezbollah will pay an increasing price.
2 Israeli soldiers were killed by a Hezbollah drone on the northern border earlier today. 8 more were wounded by anti-tank missiles. They were taken to hospital in Haifa. Hezbollah is trying to show that it has not been deterred or significantly weakened by the attacks on their communication devices. Israel is now braced for a significant response and considering more preemptive actions of its own.
You have to question whether or not this is strategically wise in terms of what it might do, in terms of just further emboldening Hezbollah's interest in trying to lash back against Israel, including on the international terrorist front, because Hezbollah is a very, very capable organization in terms of launching terrorist attacks outside of the region.
One of the big unknowns is what Iran might do. It is yet to retaliate for the killing of the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in July, and could now feel prompted to defend its ally, Hezbollah. The new Iranian president, considered a moderate leader amongst hardliners in Tehran, has called for unity in the Muslim world.
2 to 3 million Israelis are destroying Muslims, women, children, young and old. They bomb mosques and hospitals everywhere, and we're just watching. Israel finds the courage to do so because we are not together.
Although Hezbollah has said that it will stop attacking Israel if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, that wouldn't necessarily resolve Israel's underlying issue, the continued presence of Hezbollah on its border. And that is why, as things stand, the prospect of a new Lebanon war feels more a case of when, not if. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Jerusalem.
Well, for more analysis, we've got our special correspondent Alex Crawford here with me in Beirut. And Alex, just in the last few minutes, we're hearing from the IDF that they've destroyed 100 rocket launches. I mean, there are a lot of airstrikes taking place, and we also heard the drones flying overhead today.
Well, we're hearing from people down south that there's obviously a lot of activity at the moment. They're talking about a spatter of airstrikes. So clearly, the Israelis have upped and ratcheted their attacks down on the south, but it is still within a contained area along the south. And they are still, according to what the IDF has put out, still expecting some sort of retaliation in the same southern border towns from Hezbollah. So where does that leave us? I think it probably could be seen as another way of breaking up their capability, but it's not more than what we've seen over the last 10 or 11 months, in that it's staying within a sort of area where they've both been tit-for-tat crossfires. So difficult to see how to read that, apart from there is an increase, clearly, in activity down there.
Alex, thank you so much for that update. Well, as Alex has been saying and reporting, people here are terrified. They're in a state of panic, and we are monitoring all the developments here from the region. But for now, back to you, Jonathan, in London.
Yalda in Beirut, thank you. Good evening. The Prime Minister has insisted that he's in control after it emerged that he's accepted more than £100,000 worth of gifts. Sir Keir Starmer was speaking a day after Sky News revealed that he has accepted substantially more than any other MP. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, reports.
Leigh-on-Sea in Essex. This seat was Tory blue since its creation in the 1950s, until this summer. Swept up in Keir Starmer's tidal wave. But after Sky News revealed that the new PM has claimed far more in gifts and freebies than any other MP, locals are not holding back.
Disappointed, I'm disgusted. It is just disgusting.
£100,000 is a lot of money in anybody's book, isn't it? So perhaps it was unwise of him to accept all of that, I would say.
Sending his children to watch Taylor Swift concerts or a big football match down Wembley or Arsenal versus Tottenham last week, then how can we be justifying that?
In Westminster, ministers struggle to explain away the freebies.
He's declared more in the last 2 months on freebies than the average wage.
But this would relate to his job, the professional side of his life, being the leader of the opposition or the Prime Minister. And there's a lot of pressure on that role. There's a lot of scrutiny of that role.
Labour's former acting leader says defending the freebies isn't helping.
It's not a hanging offence, but I think doubling down and trying to justify it is, for some of the reasons that Ruth said, making things worse.
It's an open goal for his opponents.
We've got a Prime Minister who has taken more freebies and hospitality and gifts than any other 600 of the 650 MPs in the last 5 years by a factor of 2. And we've got millions of pensioners, including over 22,000 in my constituency of Boston and Skegness, who are furious, who are worried about how they're going to heat their homes.
Whoever I talk to in Labour, cabinet ministers, loyalists, there's a sense that number 10 hasn't got a grip and they want it to improve. Some think Chief of Staff Sue Gray will be gone within months. Others that more figures need to be brought in to bolster the political side of the operation. Keir Starmer gives the impression he thinks everything is fine.
Look, I've got a team here at number 10 and around the cabinet table who are utterly determined and focused on the change that we were elected to bring about.
But clearly there are people who are very unhappy within your team, and I'm wondering whether you've got a grip on that and whether you're the one in control here.
I'm completely in control and focused.
Scrutiny of Keir Starmer's operation will only intensify when he leaves this building and heads to Liverpool for conference, a new level of pressure for the Prime Minister. Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, the Prime Minister has another headache tonight. It seems a number of prisoners released early from jail to ease overcrowding haven't been electronically tagged. Let's go to Downing Street, join our political correspondent Gurpreet Nawan. This adding to the Prime Minister's woes.
Yeah, another headache for the Prime Minister. And it really feels like that honeymoon period for the Labour government is coming to an end, that brief window in which it could easily blame its predecessor, the Conservative government, for all its perceived failures, is starting to close, really. But nevertheless, today has found a new fall guy. This time it's the contractor Serco, which is a government contract to tag prisoners, electronically tagged prisoners, including those 1,700 prisoners who were released early last week as part of the government's plan to ease overcrowding in prisons. And at the time, when announcing that policy, the government recognised that it was a difficult decision, allowing prisoners out after serving just 40% of their sentence, but assured communities that they would be closely monitored through these electronic tags. But it's now emerged that many of them are still waiting to have their tags fitted, despite already being released, potentially hundreds of them. And the government is taking this very seriously. It says it's taking it very seriously. James Timpson, the Prisons Minister, is meeting with Serco executives. And the government said that it was holding Serco to account to address the delays in fitting offenders with tags and will be issuing penalties if the issue is not resolved quickly. Serco, for its part, said it was working hard to reduce the delays, but that will do very little to assuage the fears of victims and victims' groups who are already very anxious about the decision to release prisoners early and the levels of safeguarding that were in place.
Gurpreet in Downing Street, thank you. Well, staying with prisons, and a serving prison governor has told Sky News he fears those released early from prison under the government's new policy will reoffend and end up back inside. The governor, who we are not naming, also says prison should only be for serious and violent criminals after sentences were recently handed out to people for comments on social media. He's been speaking exclusively to our correspondent, Molly Malone.
Prison is a place that's by definition behind bars. Out of public sight, insight inside is rare.
We see violence every day. It's as simple as that.
This is a governor who works in one of the country's crowded jails. We're keeping him anonymous to protect his identity. Conditions right now mean inmates are kept behind their doors for almost 24 hours a day.
It just heightens frustration. And with that frustration becomes aggression, and with the aggression becomes violence.
Do you see prisoners taking advantage of the situation?
Yes, they do. What we call protesting behaviour has definitely increased.
And when things are tight, there's less time and space for the basics.
I shouldn't say it really, but there is a smell that you would always associate with prison.
What's that like right now?
In some cases, it's the smell of unwashed bodies.
A lack of hygiene can cause conflict, and with conflict comes violence.
For a lot of prisoners, the propensity to use or to carry weapons, it far exceeds today anything that I've ever known in my experience.
Can you wholeheartedly say that staff are safe when they go into work?
No, I don't think that we could ever say that everybody is entirely safe.
Because of all of this, the government are releasing people early to free up space, but not without risk.
There will always be people for whom you fear will go on to reoffend.
From what you've seen, is there some sense of inevitability to that?
Most definitely.
So is there an alternative? What should the future look like?
If we're going to be serious about reducing the prison population, I think we need to look at sentencing guidelines for certain offences. And I know that that's been quite topical recently, with one or two cases where we've seen people have gone to prison recently for, let's say, cyber-related offences, for comments on social media and things like that. I think prison needs to be for serious and organised crime.
Responding to this interview, the government said they inherited a prison system in crisis, putting pressure on the entire justice system and ultimately the public at risk. They said we're taking the difficult but necessary action to make sure we can keep locking up dangerous criminals and keep people safe. We thank all our staff for their hard work and will continue to drive improvements in our prisons to help more offenders turn their back on crime. Right now, the situation inside our prisons is immediate. It's likely that meaningful reform is some way off. A review of sentencing, prison spaces and the probation service could all be part of it. Molly Malone, Sky News.
The Post Office campaigner Sir Alan Bates has blamed what he's called government flim-flam artists for dragging out financial redress for victims. In the newsletter, seen by Sky News, he dismisses the compensation scheme for victims of the Horizon scandal as a gravy train for government lawyers. Our business correspondent Adele Robinson is here. In typical style then, Sir Alan not mincing his words, Adele.
Yeah, no, and when Sir Alan speaks, the nation listens, doesn't it? And he's not holding back here. He's really sticking it to the government from very strong words. You can almost hear the disdain when you read this letter that we've seen. He's already written, actually, to the Department for Business and Trade's Select Committee Chair, Liam Byrne, and what he's asked for is the deadline for financial redress for victims of the Post Office scandal to be brought forward to March of next year, so a final deadline. Now, he's referred to the 4 different schemes here, but he's specifically talking about the one that he's in, the GLOW scheme, which is the Group Litigation Order scheme. That was the one that was introduced after that landmark court case back in 2019 that involved the 555 former sub-postmasters. He has said that the government, of course, has promised full and fair redress, but it's been brought to his attention that some of the sub-postmasters who are getting on in their years, they're actually settling for far lower than their original claims worth because they just want to get it over with. He's saying that that's wrong. And he's also said, he's questioned whether or not this is part of a plan to drag this out, and his words, to exhaust victims into their deaths. I'll read an extract from some of the newsletter. It says this, he says this, this whole scheme has been and continues to be a gravy train for government lawyers, seemingly to ensure maximum income for the lawyers and minimal settlement for the victims. He goes on, I've come to the conclusion that the department's run by government-employed flim-flam artists whose only role is to drag out the GLOW scheme and probably the other schemes and spin the narrative and then bury it in bureaucracy. So he's raising concerns there over government lawyers being paid more than the victims now. In fact, he estimates as well that up to £500 million will have been spent on legal fees associated with the Post Office scandal, and he wants the Public Accounts Committee to investigate this urgently. Now, we've had a statement from the Department for Business and Trade. They've said this in reference to Sir Alan's words: it isn't acceptable that sub-postmasters feel they aren't being listened to or have their claims drawn out. Our ministers will continue to meet with those affected and work with them to get swift and fair redress paid. But time is ticking on. To put it bluntly, people are dying while they wait for financial redress. Sir Alan is running out of patience. Sub-postmasters are running out of patience. We'll be hearing, though, more on this next week when the final phase 7 of the Post Office inquiry begins, and it will be looking specifically at compensation.
OK. Adele, thank you very much. Now, a major report from the healthcare watchdog has revealed that almost half of the maternity units in England require improvement or are inadequate. The Care Quality Commission also says poor care on wards will become normalised unless urgent action is taken. Well, the NHS insists it will continue to improve its maternity services. Our health correspondent Ashish Joshi reports.
Rhiannon's baby Kate was just 6 hours old when she died. Another catastrophic failing in a broken maternity system.
I had no awareness of what was going on. The midwife sent me for a bath and placed Kate in a cold cot as opposed to a heated cot, and she left her alone in a side room because she panicked.
Rhiannon was then separated from Kate, mother and newborn ending up at different hospitals.
I was reunited with Kate after she died.
Baby Kate's death was one of hundreds investigated in the Shrewsbury maternity scandal. Now, 15 years later, health watchdog the CQC has found women and babies are still not safe from harm. Of the 131 units it inspected, almost half needed improvement. It found beds soaked in blood and staff abusing patients. And that's what makes all of this so totally unacceptable. A series of high-profile investigations led to a raft of recommendations presented to successive health secretaries here at the Department of Health. But here we are again. It's clear that no action was taken, and mothers and babies are still at risk of serious harm. The new government says it will provide extra staffing and resources, but equally important is to challenge the culture within midwifery.
We want our members to say, I can't deliver safe care, I don't believe the culture is good for the women in my care, and be able to tell people that it's not right and something needs to be done about it.
Joy Clark is a retired midwife with 44 years of experience. She's seen firsthand the racism and discrimination also flagged by the CQC.
We are working in an environment where research-based evidence is sometimes used, but not all research suits the ethnic minority women. They're different, we are different, and our symptoms and signs may be different.
Is it just cultural ignorance or is it racism?
Some racism is there too.
Nothing can ease the pain of grieving mothers like Rhiannon, but changes to the country's maternity services must be made straight away, or other families will be torn apart. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
The Bank of England has decided against cutting the base rate of interest. Instead, the rate has been kept on hold at 5%. The bank's Monetary Policy Committee voted 8-1 in favour of the decision. That was despite the US Federal Reserve last night cutting America's interest rate for the first time in more than 4 years by 0.5 percentage point. The Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, says he is still confident interest rates will come down. The scientific director of the Titan submersible has told an inquiry into the disaster that the sub malfunctioned just days before its fatal final dive. 5 people died when the vehicle imploded whilst exploring the wreck of the Titanic. Dr. Stephen Ross told the US Coast Guard hearing the incident occurred during a dive in June 2023.
The pilot crashed into the rear bulkhead. The rest of the passengers tumbled about. I ended up standing on the rear bulkhead. One passenger was hanging upside down, and the other 2 managed to wedge themselves into the bow end cap.
More than 1,000 people have been moved from their homes in northern Italy over fears that flooding sweeping through Central Europe is set to worsen. At least 24 people have died after heavy rains prompted rivers to burst their banks in the Czech Republic, Romania, Austria and Poland. Our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins reports.
In northern Italy, they're looking for survivors. Storm Boris has battered the region of Emilia-Romagna, pushing it to the brink of disaster. Floods have forced 1,000 from their homes. Now the authorities sweep for those still trapped. The choppers below moving in for a closer look. Here we can see the rescue operations by other helicopters. They're saving people by taking them up by ropes, Officer Massimo Bellotti explains. Thanks to our video system, we can do reconnaissance. They've rescued more than 500 people in the last 24 hours. Here, winching a woman to safety after the water cut off her home. And this is an all too familiar nightmare. The region was devastated by flooding last year and now is on the verge of losing it all for a second time. Italy, the latest victim of a storm, which has already left communities in neighbouring countries underwater.
The recent flooding in Central Europe has been the worst in at least 2 decades, impacting thousands of lives and causing hundreds of millions of euros worth of damage. In the Polish city of Wrocław, residents were doing what they could to defend their homes as water levels peaked. Also in town to assess the damage, the EU chief, who after meeting leaders of other flood-hit nations, pledged billions of euros of aid.
I am here to reassure you that Europe stands by your side. This is a moment of need, of disaster, of natural disaster, and we have all to stand together to overcome the challenge.
And this disaster isn't over. In Italy and Hungary, the water is still rising as Storm Boris continues to wreak havoc across Europe. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News.
And that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we're going to take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview. Tonight, I'm joined by the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. And among the stories that we'll be discussing, this story, it's on the front of the Eye. Their headline, Middle East steps closer to regional war. Don't go away, we'll see you in a minute.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win.
Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
Hello again, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers. But first, our top stories. The head of Lebanese militant group Hezbollah has threatened retaliation against Israel for the deaths of at least 37 people in a series of explosions across the country. The Prime Minister has insisted he is completely in control of Downing Street, despite his Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, being paid more than him. And Post Office campaigner Sir Alan Bates has blamed government flim-flam artists for dragging out financial redress for victims, calling the scheme a gravy train for government lawyers. Hello there, time then for the press preview. It's our first look at Friday's front pages and seeing what is making the headlines tonight. With me, columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Very good evening, nice to see you both.
Nice to see you.
So let's take a look then at some of the front pages. We'll start with the Eye, leading with warnings that the Middle East is moving closer to a regional war as tensions rise between Israel and Hezbollah. On the front of The Guardian, vows of retribution from Hezbollah's chief Hassan Nasrallah against Israel, despite the nation not yet claiming responsibility for the exploding communications devices that left 37 people dead. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer's claim that he's still in control, despite leaks revealing his chief of staff is paid more than him. Well, that features on the front of The Telegraph. What planet are they on? Asks The Star in relation to one MP's defence of the freebies worth thousands of pounds accepted by Sir Keir Starmer. Claims that Rachel Reeves has been given a £10 billion boost by the Bank of England to stave off cuts and tax rises. That's on the front of tomorrow's Times. Fears over how the elderly will cope if winter payments are taken away makes the front page of The Express, while allegations of sexual assault against former Harrods owner Mohammed Al-Fayed, who died last year, leads the Metro. And accusations that woke culture is threatening British identity from Robert Jenrick, that features on the front of the Mail. And don't forget, you can scan that QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And to do that, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. So let's get cracking. Lots to talk about. Salma, why don't you begin for us with the front of the Eye? Middle East steps closer to regional war. I mean, what a couple of days it has been. Where on earth are we now?
Well, as we've discussed previously, we are back to a very dangerous situation where we are potentially looking at a huge escalation in the region. And I'm sure your viewers already know that there have been these very audacious attacks, allegedly by Mossad, by the Israeli state, that have reached pages and walkie-talkies. In response to that, the Lebanese president has come out and talked about how there's going to be retaliation and retribution. And now you can already see Western diplomatic forces really trying to urge caution and to calm things down. Whether this actually is an escalation is yet to be seen, but we are seeing movement with Iranians actually talking about this being an appalling act, the phrase an act of war being used. So we are actually in quite a difficult situation at the moment, and preventing it might not be as easy as it has been previously.
Yeah, leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, saying Israel has crossed all the red lines. It's a declaration of war.
This is so dangerous for the reason partly that Salma mentioned when she widened it to mention Iran and others, because this is where all the danger points interconnect. Iran is close to Russia, then you get into the whole Ukraine situation and so on. And as we've discussed here before, you know, I view these things with quite a lot of alarm because the First World War had this kind of thing where things that seemingly didn't connect suddenly did. And we were in a terrible global conflagration. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen at all, but the Middle East has been a tinderbox for many, many years. And there are signs that it's coming alight. Now, hopefully that won't happen. David Lammy, you've been leading tonight on his calls for a ceasefire. But the agency these governments have with the Israeli government, not the whole of Israel, many in Israel who oppose what the Israeli government are doing, seems to me to be really limited. You know, I think it would just be ignored as tensions intensify in the Middle East. So I think it's a very dangerous moment.
Yeah, David Lammy in Paris with Anthony Blinken and others. Front page of The Guardian, Hezbollah chief vows retribution against Israel after a wave of attacks. And, of course, the Foreign Secretary telling Brits in the region, Salma, that they might want to consider leaving and leaving soon.
Yeah, so this speaks to the fact that there's a lot of tension there, and there's been lots of colour from this reporting talking about how, you know, people are feeling on the ground as well, and, you know, the difficulties that are going to be faced and fear that's going to be faced. I just want to go back to one point. There is a real difficulty around the diplomacy of this because we've had Benjamin Netanyahu basically criticise the British government's position on stopping sending weapons to Israel. And I think that is also going to make the situation difficult. So if we are asking for a diplomatic effort on the part of Western powers, it is going to be limited because of the actions that we've taken. And so, there is a real sort of pushback from the Israeli government, from the Israeli Prime Minister, at any of those attempts. So I think we are actually in a really difficult position on that side as well. I mean, we don't have a great voice, I think, in this. It's the US that matters.
The US is always the key. But that shouldn't mean that Israel basically has a veto on the British government's approach to what arms it sells to them. And that's the delicacy, that maybe Britain loses whatever leverage it has, minimal. But at the same time, it cannot just say, right, because of that, we will supply Israel with what it wants when we see the consequences.
No, I agree with you entirely. The British government needs to take decisions in its interest and in the interest of its people.
Or its moral judgment.
And its responsibility as an international actor. But the way that this conflict has unfolded, it's been tribal and it's about taking sides. It has been right from the top all the way down to the bottom by anybody who feels affected by this. So I think that is an element that we actually do need to understand and does colour some of the negotiations or some of the discussions that will happen behind the scenes.
Yeah, and the UN Security Council meeting tomorrow to discuss what is an increasingly worrying situation. Let's move on to events here in the UK then. Front of the Daily Telegraph, I am still in control, says Starmer as feud erupts. The honeymoon period didn't last very long, Steve.
They haven't really had a honeymoon. I have to say, though, about this headline, I mean, there are issues going on behind the scenes, which hopefully we'll have a chance to explore. But this headline is one of those classic traps. And remember, a lot of the papers we're about to look at are Tory supporting and loathe Labour. However, so Keir Starmer gave a whole series of regional interviews this afternoon. And because of the whole stuff about Sue Gray and all the other internecine briefings, he was asked, are you in control of number 10? Now, imagine if he said, I'm not actually. It's total chaos. Of course he was going to say, I'm in control. But then the headlines come out, Starmer crisis, he has to say so early on that he's in control. Well, he was asked. And he had no other option but to say, I'm in control. Having said that, the fact that there is this feverish questioning is not solely media fabrication. The briefings are going on against Sue Gray, his chosen chief of staff, and her people and allies are fighting back. And it's very unusual for that level of briefing internally to happen in a government. They won a landslide a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago. It's very early on and in the build-up to their first party conference. Very odd, don't you think so?
And the Daily Telegraph also using language like this, civil war breaking out at the centre of his government. I mean, is that fair? Is that too strong, or do you think it is really serious?
So I think it's very serious. I think it's serious for two reasons. One, the message that it sends is that we are actually not focused on delivery, we are focused on our internal squabbles that feel very petty in comparison to what a lot of...
if most people actually care how much Sue Gray earns.
The fact that it's on the front page of a lot of papers today means that it has had some cut-through. I mean, we're about to look at the Daily Star and
we'll do it now if you want. Let's
do it now because the Daily Star is talking about this. That is what I would describe as cut-through. And, it is exactly... I mean, there's a reference to the business secretary there, who I haven't met. He's actually quite a nice person, but they refer to him as a moron. That says, 91 grand a year MPs deserve a bit of relaxation. They've gone out and they've said all these things that they think are perfectly sensible, but they haven't really understood the political context that they are in. They are not able to sort of take that sort of approach to these issues because the election was all about that tone of being whiter than white, a bit holier than thou, I might say. And it's sort of crumbling. And so you can't have these kinds of stories, civil war, pay, freebies, going about and still retain your credibility.
Let's unpick a bit of that. I think civil war is a massive exaggeration. A civil war happens over policy when there is a real significant breakdown over policy, like with the Tories over Europe. And that's when a government is in deep crisis. This isn't a civil war. However, the tensions are real. The fact that people are briefing, knowing that it will cause damage to the government. There's one advisor quoted as saying, Grey is the only pensioner to benefit from this Labour government. Well, that attacks the government on about 8 different levels. That person should be sacked. That person won't be identified. So the briefings continue and they should stop. And in that sense, Keir Starmer does need to get a grip on the messaging and the way they deal with these newspapers who are instinctively hostile. But quite often these Tory papers usually give Labour, when on the rare occasions when they win elections, a kind of honeymoon, you know, where they realise their readers might have voted Labour, they wanted the Tories out. But this time they are gunning for them very early, and you've got to be very careful to avoid giving them ammunition.
Well, let's bring in the front of the Mail, which is certainly on the attack. Starmer on the rack, Salma.
Yeah, I mean, it's just when the Mail gives you just sort of simple bullet points, it sort of, I mean, let's just go back to this point on civil war. Number 10 aids in open revolt. Perhaps revolt is a better word for it, because you are talking about one significant person who is supposed to have responsibility and other people that are supposed to be working towards Sue Gray not being satisfied or happy about it. That actually speaks then to the Prime Minister's judgment about the way this person has gone in, the way that controls and structures are in place, and the way that his team is running. It is dysfunctional right from the get-go. So he is going to have to step in at some point because, yes, I acknowledge that these are centre-right newspapers, but the fact that they are being briefed, the fact that this is being spilling out into the open is absolutely appalling.
The Mole's got a problem with Sue Gray rather than the Prime Minister, you think?
Sorry, who's got a problem?
The Mole, whoever's leaking.
Well, I don't think it's not just one person by all accounts.
And by the way, I think it might be civil servants as well as political appointees, because she worked in the civil service before, and there's quite a lot of stuff that's left over from all of that. But where it does come down to Keir Starmer is he is the elected Prime Minister with the power. I always remember when papers became obsessed with Alistair Campbell. So Alistair Campbell's humiliating Tony Blair with all his power. Well, Tony Blair gave Alistair Campbell that power. And clearly, Keir Starmer rates Sue Gray and thinks she has an experience of Whitehall that a new government needs and would have otherwise lacked. So it's up to him, really, how much power she has. And the attacks on her really end up being an attack on him. But she's been the story now for a long time, and that's dangerous for the government more widely.
Yeah, especially given that we've got the party conference as well around the corner.
Which should be, for them, a celebratory event. They've won a landslide, having been out of power for 14 years. But I can't remember the build-up for a party conference with a new government just elected with these kind of tensions. And in that sense, he does need to get a grip. But these headlines about how humiliating that he's had to assert his control. Well, he was asked about it in a series of interviews. Yeah, so
it's a good point. He didn't really have much of a choice. Thank you both very much for the moment. Plenty more still to come from tomorrow's papers, including this on the front of the Times. Their headline: Reeves told to reverse cuts after $10 billion boost. Stay with us. Back in a couple of minutes.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. I've reported from around the world and around the UK.
I'm Mark Stone, I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Washington, DC. And beyond the United States, from across the world, I report on the biggest stories.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I remember some of the worst of the violence here.
I'm Alex Crawford, and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello. No, yes, what is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
Either way, he's a
Boris Johnson, just for the record, would say he's not a
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Salma and Steve are still with us here in the studio. Let's have a look, Salma, at the front of the Times. A £10 billion boost. That's good news.
Yes, it is, but the Times have sort of put it as if the Bank of England is, like, providing £10 billion. This is about fiscal tightening, easing. So that means the amount of money that's available in the system. When you're having quantitative easing, you are putting more money into the system. When you are having quantitative tightening, you are putting less money into the system. So this is Bank of England saying we're going to ease the tightening. So on the accounts, it looks like Rachel Reeves has got £10 billion more to spend. Now, this is going to create a bit of a political problem because there'll be lots of people who will be asking for lots of
pensioners,
things.
winter fuel payments.
Winter fuel. And so the Times is rightly pointing out that there are lots of Labour MPs who are going to be asking for things. She has a little bit more breathing space. And I will say, for a Chancellor in a tight economic position, about to give their first budget, this is probably really welcome news.
It just shows the madness of the pre-election tax and spend debate, where she was interviewed, so how do you find 10p for this and 20p in a black hole? Then suddenly £10 billion arrives, as often happens when you're in government. And if it manifests itself in the way that Salma suggests it might, and Salma thinks it might be even more than 10 billion, that is hugely useful. Now, there will be a huge debate about how she should use that money. And the Times suggests that she won't use it to spend. She'll use it to continue this sort of focus on balancing the books. If she makes that call, there will be quite a lot of concern about it. But let's see. But it's basically really good news for her if it's the case. She's suddenly got 10 billion that she didn't expect to have.
Yeah, it's a good front page, isn't it, by the Times? Good story. OK, let's finish off this section with a look at the front of the Daily Mail. Steve, why don't you kick off with this? Mass immigration and woke culture putting our identity at risk.
Yeah, it's one of the classic headlines, a classic statement from Robert Jenrick, of course, standing for the Tory leadership. Every word needs clarification. What does he mean by English? What does he mean by identity? What does he mean by the threat? And so on. Is it English or British identity? We were talking beforehand, you know, this is 10 years since the Scottish referendum on independence, but he's just talking, so what does he mean by English? What is the threat?
Yeah.
So it gets a headline which will appeal to that readership, some of whom will have a vote in this leadership contest. It doesn't really tell us anything.
Well, he's standing to be the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, and as you say, you know, we've just marked the 10-year anniversary since the Scottish referendum vote for independence. So, you know, focusing on English identity, I think, is probably the wrong note to strike. I mean, look, I'm a Conservative Party member. I have a vote in this leadership contest, and judging by this headline, I certainly won't be voting for Mr. Jenrick.
Who do you want? Are you
Well,
to tell us?
If Tom Tugendhat makes it to my ballot, he'll be getting my vote.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Steve?
What Salma's endorsement for Tugendhat? Well, I think that's very good news for Tom Tugendhat to have such a distinguished figure endorsing him. But I also agree with her reaction to this. I mean, it's such lazy playing to the gallery. You know, now admittedly that's the headline, but he knew this would be the kind of headline, and. But he's targeting this tiny electorate of Tory party members, of which Salma is one, and he knows what they want to hear. Whether this appeals to a wider electorate in 4 or 5 years' time.
Yeah, that's the question.
That is the question.
Yeah. OK, thank you both very much. Really fascinating getting your thoughts on all of that. I know you're sticking around. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, Hezbollah's leader threatens retaliation as Israel continues its attacks in Lebanon. All the details for you in a couple of minutes.
Conflict. They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle